The Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 5, Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. His crimes earned him the moniker of the Visalia Ransacker and the East Area Rapist, but Joseph DeAngelo would become one of the most notorious for his final nickname, the Golden State Killer. Between 1974 and 1986, DeAngelo committed untold atrocities, all while leading a seemingly average life as a husband and a small-town cop. On December 10, 1975, Detective Bill McGowan crept between the houses of a small-town neighborhood in Visalia, California. The quiet unnerved him, and his muscles tensed before he turned each corner. Something broke the silence behind him. McGowan spun around to see a masked figure lurking by the side of a home. Without hesitation, McGowan fired a warning shot into the air. The prowler stopped, then stepped out of the shadows with his hands up. Realizing the detective had him cornered, he begged McGowan not to shoot him. To prove he surrendered, he started to remove his mask. The detective pointed a flashlight, trying to get a better look at the elusive Visalia Ransacker, but the burglar was a trained cop and a war veteran. He was waiting for McGowan to let his guard down. The detective strained to see the man's face in the dark. The ransacker saw his chance. Without warning, the shaggy-haired figure drew a gun and shot at McGowan. The bullet hit the detective's flashlight, sending shards of glass into his eyes. Then, the prowler disappeared into the night. As he ran, adrenaline pumped through the burglar's body. The rush was like no other, and his appetite for it only grew. Soon, he would stop being known as the Visalia Ransacker and be California's Golden State Killer. During his reign of terror, in the 70s and 80s, it's believed DeAngelo murdered 12 people and raped 45 women. Joseph James DeAngelo was born into a decorated military family in Bath, New York. DeAngelo Sr. was a World War II sergeant with several medals to his name. His brother was also a World War II vet. He received the Purple Heart and was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery. Because of DeAngelo Sr.'s career in the Air Force, the family moved quite a bit. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, while DeAngelo Jr. was young, his father got into trouble with the police for abusing his mom. The authorities threatened to kick him out of the Air Force if he continued. It was also suggested that DeAngelo and his siblings were also victims of his father's abuse. While DeAngelo was around 9 or 10, he experienced another traumatic event that changed him forever. It happened when the family was stationed at a German Air Force base. One day, young DeAngelo and his sister, Constance, went to an abandoned warehouse on the base to play. They were approached by two airmen they didn't know. While DeAngelo watched, the men snatched up 7-year-old Constance and sexually abused her. What made the tragedy worse, when the two children told their parents about the rape, there were no consequences, and the children were ordered to never speak about it again. It's possible this tragedy could have created a vile fantasy in DeAngelo, and that he sought to recreate it. It's likely the abuse the children endured, their failure to protect Constance, may have primed him for violence later in life. DeAngelo's family only got more dysfunctional as he matured. While he was in his teens, his parents divorced. Both remarried soon after, and the children moved in with their mother. They lived in rural Auburn, California. DeAngelo Sr. moved to Korea, where he started a new family there. He had another set of kids, and gave them the exact same names as his previous marriage. Not only did he leave his kids behind, he replaced them. DeAngelo Jr. was forced to grapple with feelings of abandonment and inadequacy. His search for power and control led him to the military. After graduating high school in 1964, he went to Vietnam with the Navy. This may have been an attempt to gain his estranged father's approval. After Vietnam, he enrolled in college. He studied criminal justice at Cal State Sacramento. Dr. Stanton Salmonell, an expert in criminal behavior and author of the book The Criminal Mind, conducted a study that suggested career criminals found that many of them aspired to be cops when they were kids. He wrote that it was the excitement and the ability to wield absolute power over other humans that attracted them to the job, and in doing so, being cited as heroes. DeAngelo had his sights set on law enforcement, It would offer him a position of authority and control, something he lacked growing up with a possessive father. While in school, he met a fellow student named Bonnie Jean Caldwell. The two hit it off, and they were engaged in 1972. Bonnie was a lab assistant, and D'Angelo was affiliated with the Vets Club and the President's Honor Roll. They appeared to be the ideal couple, but in reality, they were far from perfect. Bonnie later recalled D'Angelo's bizarre sexual behavior. According to her, his appetite was insatiable, and he wanted to go on for hours. When she was interviewed, she told the police that she was never forced to do anything, but he was oblivious to her exhaustion and discomfort during their encounters. He also had tendencies of breaking away from her when he was about to climax. He'd return minutes later and continue. She said that he would do this several times during the night. Bonnie admitted D'Angelo was her first sexual experience, so she had no point of reference on what was normal. A study done by the University of New South Wales on aggressive behavior suggested that when men feel entitled to sex, they're less likely to exhibit self-control and more likely to be hostile toward women. Author's note. In my career as a beat cop, a domestic violence detective, and a crimes against children detective, I've spoken to many prostitutes. They tell me that when men were paying for it, it was common for them to treat them like objects, not like human beings. They would sometimes become more violent because of this. Eventually, D'Angelo's behavior became too much for Bonnie. She broke off their relationship before the wedding. Less than a year later, she married another man. The breakup likely caused D'Angelo to feel the familiar pangs of abandonment and insecurity. He would call Bonnie in moments of rage and claim that he hated her. D'Angelo also married soon after their breakup. He met 20-year-old law student Sharon Huddle in November of 1973. They were married. 28-year-old D'Angelo was hired by the Exeter Police Department. It's a small city about 50 miles southeast of Fresno. As soon as he became a cop, D'Angelo began to dabble in crime. It's believed he started as a voyeur. In mid-1973, residents in the nearby town of Visalia reported seeing a strange man at their window. His first confirmed crime was a report in March of 1974. He began a series of burglaries and break-ins. Author's note. Many of my suspects that were on the sex offender registry started as voyeurs. They're dismissed in public as peeping toms. The problem is they evolve. Peeping toms are having a sexual fantasy. The fantasies become more involved, and then they act on them. This crime spree earned D'Angelo the first of many monikers, the Visalia Ransacker. He prowled neighborhoods, often staking out homes for hours before breaking in. He developed a pattern to his home invasions. The Visalia Ransacker would sneak in through an open window or an unlocked door and go through the owner's possessions. He vandalized their property, scattering women's underwear. He would steal personal items that had no real monetary value. He was collecting trophies. D'Angelo became a prolific thief. He would often do break-ins several times a day. On Saturday, November 20th, 1974, separate incidents were reported. Ironically, he was assigned to a burglary detail. They had over 120 reported break-ins. Ransacking empty homes stopped giving him a thrill. He needed more to stimulate him. In September of 1975, it brought him to the Snelling home. Claude Snelling was a journalism professor. He awoke to a commotion in his home. D'Angelo had broken into his house and attempted to drag his 16-year-old daughter out of the home. Claude caught D'Angelo in the act. D'Angelo panicked, pulled a pistol, and shot Claude in the chest. He later died. D'Angelo kicked his daughter in the face before fleeing. After the attack, the police department assigned a detective to watch the streets. Detective McGowan spotted a masked man prowling between the homes. He knew it was probably the man they were searching for. McGowan rushed over and attempted to place the man under arrest, but D'Angelo's training as a police officer gave him an advantage. He tricked McGowan into thinking he would surrender by taking his mask off. No one had ever seen the ransacker's face. McGowan's curiosity got the best of him. Rather than keeping his gun on the suspect, the detective pulled out a flashlight to get a better look at the criminal. In the blink of an eye, D'Angelo pulled a gun and shot at McGowan. The bullet missed him, but it hit his flashlight. The shards from the broken flashlight blinded McGowan temporarily. In the commotion, D'Angelo was able to escape. It was a frighteningly close call, one that D'Angelo made sure would never happen again. That night marked the end of the Visalia ransacker, but the worst was yet to come. His face had been seen by the police detective, and a composite drawing was made. McGowan described the prowler as having an athletic build, in his early 20s, possibly left-handed, and having shaggy brown hair. D'Angelo, now 30, grew worried his colleagues at the police department would recognize him. Deciding it was too risky to stay in the area, he applied for a job at the Auburn Police Department. In May 1976, he got the position and moved to Auburn with his wife Sharon. Auburn police officer Nicholas Willick would later describe D'Angelo as an average Joe. He said there was always something off about him. He said that D'Angelo had a bachelor's degree, all kinds of training, but never really fit in with the other guys. Police officers will laugh and cut up because of the stress of the job, but he said that D'Angelo was always serious. While D'Angelo maintained this professional facade by day, once night fell, he became the monster known as the East Area Rapist. June 17, 1976. It's likely he stalked his victim, a telephone company employee. She'd later report a dark car driven by her house multiple times, but the driver would always turn his head to keep him from being identified. She said that for weeks, she got various hang-up phone calls, likely to make sure that she was home alone. On the night of the 17th, D'Angelo parked his car by a nearby train track and crossed through backyards to get to the victim's house. Once there, he cut the phone line before picking the back door lock and making his way inside. He appeared in the victim's bedroom doorway. He wore a ski mask, a dark t-shirt, and nothing else. He tapped on the doorframe and mockingly called out her name. She woke up to see the visibly aroused intruder at the foot of her bed. She squirmed, but D'Angelo held a knife to her temple and threatened to kill her. He tied her hands behind her back and raped her. After the assault, he tied her ankles together. He picked up her slip from the floor as a trophy and disappeared. She was bound and terrified. She stayed silent, fearing the attacker would come back through her bedroom door. After a while, she gave up waiting. She wasn't sure if he was still inside, but she had to call for help. As it turns out, the phone line had not been completely severed. She called police, but the rapist had fled. Dozens of similar attacks soon followed across Greater Sacramento. The press dubbed the new threat the East Area Rapist. The community was in a state of terror. People began sleeping with guns by their sides. Animal shelters had record numbers of adoptions. Locksmiths couldn't keep up with the demand because people wanted better locks on their doors. His MO remained consistent. For the next few months, he'd break into women's homes that were either alone or home with young children. In some cases, he would tie the children up before attacking their mother. Sometimes he would briefly stop the assault, ransack the house, and then return to assaulting the victim. Sometimes this would go on for hours. Some of the victims would report he would yell out, "I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you," during the assault. He obviously had a fixation on his ex-fiancée. It likely contributed to his overall hatred of women. Other victims reported that D'Angelo wept and hyperventilated after raping them. They said that he would call out to his mother, saying that he was sorry and he didn't want to do this. He would call her mommy, as if in a childlike state. James Garbarino, an expert in violent inmates, called some of his patients untreated traumatized children. In the aftermath of his attacks, D'Angelo felt momentary shame for giving in to his depraved urges. They were likely rooted in the unresolved trauma of witnessing his younger sister being assaulted. After being unable to protect her from vile men, he became one himself. Serial rapists usually build up the attack in their mind. They obsess over it. It's a mixture of excitement, anticipation, anxiety, pleasure, and fear. Most rapists of this type find little satisfaction in the rape because it doesn't live up to the fantasy, and that's why they find other victims. For 3 years, the East Area Rapist continued to chase the high he got from his crimes, but like any addict, the thrill was more elusive. His assaults became routine. He planned out and executed his break-ins and rapes so well, the sense of danger that excited him was eventually gone. He started hunting victims further west of Sacramento. He was hoping the unfamiliar territory would heighten the risk and the euphoria he felt. In 1977, his crime spree intensified again. Preying on single women was no longer enough. He began to target couples. He started targeting a waitress that lived in Citrus Heights. He began to call her repeatedly and hang up, but this one was different. He wanted to directly approach the victim before his attack. So one day, he showed up at the waitress's front door in broad daylight, claiming to be registering pets with the American Pet Association. It was a recon mission. He wanted to become more familiar with the house and look for easy points of entry. The young woman immediately knew something was off, so she sent him away. But instead of leaving, he lingered at the garage and fiddled with the lock. When he left, she went over to her neighbor and asked if the Pet Association guy had knocked on their door. He replied he hadn't, and the guy hadn't stopped at any other house on the street. This alarmed her. She immediately called the Better Business Bureau, and they confirmed the organization named the American Pet Association operated in the area. She became fearful. She woke up several times in the night, certain that she heard noises coming from the inside of the house. She tried to wake up her husband, but he dismissed the sounds as probably stray cats outside. She was the first to notice the masked figure standing over her bed. He told her if she made any noises, he would kill her. He threw a pair of shoelaces on the bed and told her to bind her husband's hands and feet. She tied them loosely, but D'Angelo noticed. He made her retie the knot tighter. Once the husband was bound, D'Angelo aggressively pulled the waitress's hands behind her back and tied them together. With the couple tied up, he searched the room and then smashed a bottle of pennies with his pistol. He rummaged through their closet, likely looking for a trophy to take with him. Soon he returned to the room. He undid the slip knot from the woman's ankles and pulled her off the bed. He dug the gun into her back and told her to walk and not to look at him. He threatened to shoot them both if she didn't do exactly what he said. He threw her onto the living room floor. He went back into the bedroom to threaten the husband again, then to tell him that he was going to take a break and have a beer. He returned to the waitress, ripped a towel to blindfold her, and she heard him remove his pants. She cried, but he threatened to slit her throat if she didn't quiet down. After raping her, he rolled her over and put a cup and saucer on her back. This was part of his MO, as a falling cup would alert him to any movement by the victim. He noticed the rings on her hand, and despite her pleas, he pulled them off her fingers and left the home for good. There are many reasons serial killers take trophies. Sometimes it helps them relive their crime. Some would be unsure they lived their fantasy without a trophy to validate it. None of the items D'Angelo took were ever recovered. D'Angelo continued a steady stream of attacks on unsuspecting couples. On February 2, 1978, he was stalking a house in the Rancho Cordova neighborhood. A young couple was out walking their dog and came across him on the prowl. He didn't have his mask on, and they saw him. He couldn't let them escape. He chased them down to the backyard of a nearby house, shot them both. The couple later died from their wounds. Northern California communities were gripped with fear. The prowler seemed uncatchable. In 4 years, D'Angelo allegedly committed countless ransackings, 27 rapes, and 3 murders. The unknown assailant was constantly in the news. To make it worse, authorities had reason to believe that the East Area rapist followed the media coverage and took pleasure in the panic he was causing. One of the original investigators on the case recalled a community meeting, and a man was berating the police department and their inability to catch who was doing this. He also criticized the husbands and the victims for not fighting back. Shortly thereafter, D'Angelo allegedly broke into the man's house and sexually assaulted his wife. His attacks were deliberate. Certain dates were triggers. He committed attacks on his wedding anniversary, 2 years in a row. It's possible his anniversary brought up feelings of resentment because his marriage wasn't a happy one. Neighbors would recall hearing screaming matches between he and his wife. They had separate bedrooms. Another major event would increase his violence. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department. On July 2, 1979, the 33-year-old was caught stealing a hammer and dog repellent. He was charged with misdemeanor shoplifting. His former partner was the chief of police now, and he was the one that fired him. He later reported D'Angelo was never particularly good at his job, and he was always doing the bare minimum and resisting orders. Sometime after the firing, the chief said his daughter spotted a man at their window. When he went out to investigate, there were signs of a possible prowler, footprints left in the dirt. But after that night, it never happened again. He didn't suspect D'Angelo was the prowler until decades later. Late 1979 marked a turning point for D'Angelo. He decided he would no longer leave his victims alive. This has been episode 5 of the Killer Bee True Crime Series, Part 1, The Golden State Killer. Thank you for listening, and God bless.